Okay. Hi, everybody. If there's anyone there. I have no idea if there's anybody here. Might be talking into the void. So let's see what's going on. Oh, there's a few people there already. That's amazing. Well, hello, everybody. Good to see you. And what I'm going to do tonight is answer some questions. You can pretty much ask me anything. Can you hear me, first of all? Can everyone hear me? Ah, great. Okay. Fantastic. This is working a little bit better than it did last time. So I'm going to first explain what I'm going to do, right? So I'll answer anything you might want to ask me. And then the other thing is I want to remind everybody that my crowdfunding campaign is entering its very last hours. So I would like to thank everybody that has so generously supported the project so far. We are very close to the goal already, which is incredible. And I think we're going to get there. But I'll put the link up in the live stream description if anyone wants to check it out. Basically, we've got 10 hours to go. This is a all or nothing campaign, which means if we don't hit the target, then the project won't be funded. So the last few hours, as always in any crowdfunding campaign, are really crucial. So I'll come back to that periodically, but basically let's start by, let's start with some questions. So this was, by the way, completely unplanned. I just decided to do this about an hour ago. So that's why there was no advance notice. Anyway, let's answer some questions. So Thomas Drescher says, how much further do you have to go? With the crowdfunding campaign, we're at about 62%, I think. And that's really good, of course. That's actually really good because I've done 2 other crowdfunding campaigns, and this one has already substantially surpassed the amount that we were able to raise last time. And the last one was about 4 years ago. So that's good. I'm really grateful that so many people have supported it. There was a question about what happens if the goal is not reached. What happens to the album? What'll happen is it'll take probably a lot longer to release it. But I'm pretty confident that that's not going to happen. I think I really do think we'll reach the goal. Yeah, it'll just delay the release of the album. It'll make it more complicated. I'll have to keep, I'll just have to keep on trying to raise the funds, basically. So, yeah, Merrick's there. Thank you, Merrick. Yeah, I like these headphones too. Beyerdynamic, very, very good. So, Tristan Scott, woo, I'm excited for the release. Yeah, I'm super excited for it too. I've had some other albums be released, but this is really something special, and I'm not just saying that. I'm really proud of this album. We worked on it like crazy. We, it was years in the making, literally, and we had just an absolute dream team put together to record it, to perform the pieces. We worked with one of my favorite conductors in the world, Luigi Gaggero. We worked with Ensemble Proton Baron, who I've been collaborating with very closely for over 10 years. Every single person involved in this project is either a cherished collaborator or a close personal friend or both. And yeah, we just had absolutely wonderful conditions in Bern and in Zurich recording it. And what can I say? I want everybody to hear it. I'm really proud of it. So Maximilian M.K. Gill, what is your favorite symphony or concerto? My favorite symphony is Beethoven's 8th, I would have to say. You know, I've actually got a video planned on that piece. I've been planning it for a while now. It's a little embarrassing. It really should be out by now. But I have a long list of videos that I'm planning to do, and that's one of them. Yeah, the Beethoven 8th is amazing. He systematically refuses to do the thing that you would expect on every level all the time. And it's an amazing piece. It's really quite fascinating. Eric Leiter, so are you recording your complete works to date for this project? So yes, actually that is my idea. I've got, let's see, 3 portrait CDs already out and a bunch of other individual pieces on different labels. And by this point, I think 20 of my pieces are commercially recorded. I have a catalog of approximately 30 published works. With this new release, it'll bring the total up to 24 out of 30. There'll be 5 or 6 pieces left to record. And yeah, so my idea there is, you know, I'm a realist. I know that most people are not going to have a chance to attend a concert. They're not going to have a chance to hear these pieces live. Just I have far more listeners on YouTube and via physical media than I will in a concert setting. That's just the reality. So it's extremely important to me that the pieces be available to everybody who wants to hear them and not just people who are able to attend a concert. It's really, really important. So I want everything that's published to be recorded, you know, with hand-picked players, the best ensembles that I can get, and so on. And that's a crazy thing to do. It's very, very hard to bring off. Recording projects are insanely difficult to organize and to finance these days for all sorts of reasons. So it consumes a lot of my time. And I'm probably writing fewer pieces than I would if I weren't doing these sorts of recording projects, but I really want everything to be available. So there you go. Now, there's a lot of questions coming in really quickly. I'm not going to be able to answer them all, but if your question is not getting answered, please, you can ask it again, and I'm going to try to keep up with all the comments in the stream here. Do you think self-taught composers are at a disadvantage compared to those who work with a teacher? In most cases, yes, Damien, definitely. But not in all cases. Not in all cases. I think the main disadvantage is that it's easier to make consistent progress if you have some kind of external pressure placed upon your work. You know, if there's somebody that you ritualistically have to interact with and show them your work, then that's going to be a bit of a forcing function on both on your discipline and also on your productivity. Then there's the fact that you're going to be regularly interacting with other students and you're going to be getting their feedback. And that's really very useful. And finally, you know, if you're in a good program for composition, you have the opportunity to have your pieces played and to hear them regularly. And that's probably the most important thing of all, because it's very difficult to make progress as a composer if you're not regularly hearing your own work. Of course, you can do that other ways than being in school, and there are many successful composers who have pursued a very independent path, but it's a much harder way of going about things. So I think for most people, you know, you would probably find it better or easier, more beneficial to work with a good teacher. So Clement Mattox writes, I'm wondering if, given your robust knowledge of classical tradition and repertoire, there's ever a pressure you feel to contribute or pay homage to said traditions. I wouldn't phrase it that way. It's not a pressure. It's more like the air that you breathe. I mean, I can't imagine actually being a composer without the sense of a connection to something that came before and my response to the work that came before, because you can't create out of a void, you know. The elements that go into a composition are public property in many respects. So for example, if I decide to write a piece for piano, it's obvious that the piano belongs to everybody. The piano is human property. So I didn't invent the piano. It's not my creation. Same with the tempered scales that we use. Same with any element of musical language, really. So all of those things have a resonance to them. And, you know, if you write for certain instruments in certain registers in certain ways, that will have connotations, whether you like it to or not. You know, It's like if you have certain figures on a French horn, it's going to immediately make people think of the woods and the outdoors. These are just, it's part of the instrument's identity, et cetera, et cetera. So you can't actually get away from that even if you want to, and it's better to work with it productively and consciously rather than unconsciously, I believe. Artem writes, what is your favorite Ukrainian composer / piece? I'd love to see you in Kiev sometime when it's safer. Yeah, I would love to go back to Kiev. It's a wonderful city. I've had the great pleasure and the honor of spending several weeks in Kiev on 2 separate occasions and working closely with the Ucho ensemble and also various solo musicians from the Kiev region. And well, one composer that I think is doing fantastic work is Maxime Kolomiets, who's a friend of mine. He lives in Kiev, and he's doing amazing work, that, you know, unclassifiable work. He studied in Germany, in Kiev, and also in Germany, I think in Freiburg. And that's a name to remember, Maxime Kolomiets, Kolomiiets. So, Jason Bronson, are you a fan of the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds and Smile? I hear elements of these in your earlier pop compositions. Well, Smile was really important when I was a teenager. That was actually, you know, and that's not an original thing to say, by the way, because lots of people get into composition via things like that. And the sonic imagination, I think, of Smile was something that really impressed me. The unusual combinations of instruments, the orchestrations, the layering, and so on. But I lost interest in the Beach Boys very quickly. And yeah, I haven't really returned to that music since. There's aspects of it that I find, well, of less interest now. What can I say? I find it rhythmically extremely limited. I think that's the main problem that I have with the Beach Boys. It's these really mechanical rhythms that really don't have much life to them. That might be partly because of the fact that they were instrumentalists, but they mostly didn't play on their own records. So you get this very bland, kind of anonymous sound of these sort of Hollywood studio musicians coming in and you know, doing a really accurate job, but it just doesn't have any life to it. So, okay. Arno writes, hey Samuel, when can we expect to hear a string quartet from you? Probably not anytime soon. I've made a couple of attempts at it. I actually wrote a string quartet when I was 19 or 20, and it's sitting in sitting in my archive somewhere. It's never been played. I wrote a really tiny 2-minute long string quartet about 5 or 6 years after that was in fact played. And I sketched out a piece when I was living in Spain, a string quartet movement, but I never finished it. I don't know, maybe someday, but it's not a huge preoccupation right now. Thomas Drescher writes, do you think it's still possible to write interesting tonal music of real value? Well, of course, that's what most people do. Most music is tonal, even today. That's just, yeah, that's just impossible to avoid. As you know, yeah, that's a conclusion that's impossible to avoid coming to. So, yes, some of it is very good, and some of it is not very good. I don't know what to say about that. I don't find the question of tonal versus atonal to be particularly relevant really anymore to composers or to the current cultural moment. I don't think it's an important question. I think there are other things that are much more significant in composition than that. And and it's also a false dichotomy, this idea that you have to choose, you have to write either tonal music or like nice, safe tonal music, or, you know, adventurous avant-garde atonal music or whatever. It's really a relic from the 1950s and 1960s. And yeah, it's not a relevant spectrum anymore. Is opera dying? No, I don't think opera's dying. Practically every composer I know is either working on an opera or has already written one. it remains an extremely prestigious medium for composers generally. So no, I don't think you can say it's dying. I mean, look, if you're a composer, it's financially beneficial to write operas. There's no question. That's how you can get the most substantial commissions and the most public recognition for your work. Also, opera is a very spectacular medium. It's a very public one. It gets a lot of attention. But you can also have a spectacular failure if you're writing an opera. So there are also dangers involved in it. What are the important things in modern composition? Well, that's kind of like saying, what are the important things in modern cuisine? I mean, it depends, doesn't it? Tanos F writes, I'd love to hear something about Xenakis from you. Yeah, well, me too. I'd like to do something on Xenakis. I haven't yet, but I'm planning to. I am planning to. He's too important to ignore, that's for sure. Wonderful musician, a genius, creative persona, absolutely amazing figure. I will definitely do something on him. Actually, I should probably say what it is I'm working on at the moment in terms of videos and analyses. I'm currently working on filming a new Webern video, and I'm slightly of two minds about that because I've already done 3 videos on Webern, but it happens that I think he's still a crucial figure, and there's a lot to be said, and I think he's still incredibly badly misunderstood. So I'm going to be doing something on Webern. It's this time it'll be on one of the earlier pieces, and I'm really excited about that. So that video, I'm hoping, will be ready fairly soon. I'm going to be doing a video on Hugo Wolf as well, on the Mörike Lieder. For those of you who are fans of Hugo Wolf, it's fascinating music. Planning to do something on Scriabin, and the Beethoven 8th Symphony, and a few other things as well. So, deflating atheism. All this time I've been saying Xenakis. I'd like to know how a Greek person would pronounce it, actually. I have no idea. All I know is that I live in France, and my pronunciation of the word Xenakis is probably derived from what I hear over here, Xenakis. Actually, they put the accent on the 3rd syllable. Anyway, it's probably wrong no matter what. What do you think of free jazz? Oh, it's wonderful, both in terms of the things that I've heard, the recordings I've heard, and also just the idea of it, the potential of it, the idea that you could have this spontaneous meeting of minds with very little premeditation, I think is quite fascinating. Although I understand that there's some more recent investigations into this, and the Ornette Coleman Free Jazz album apparently is not quite as free as we may have thought. There were some sketching. There was some sketching that was done, and some amount of rehearsal, I believe, before the recording session. I could have that wrong. So, Xenakis. Okay, good to know. Thank you. So, what else do we have? Greetings from Ecuador. How do you build a sense of musical form at the time of writing? I'm having trouble conceiving the macro of the piece. Thanks a lot. Yeah, well, that's a hard problem. Actually, I talk about this quite a lot with my private composition students. The problem is that in composition, you might conceptualize it as there being 3 planes, temporal planes that you have to keep your eye on. There's the sort of local scale, the local level. There's the medium term, and then there's the sort of large scale architecture of the piece. And the thing is, all of those 3 levels of the composition interact with each other in complicated ways, right? So the large scale form of the piece might flow organically out of the micro scale, or it might not. Those 2 things might be disconnected. It depends on the musical language. But what I've often observed in composition students is you become kind of obsessed with the micro level. You focus on getting all the local details exactly right. You focus on these sound objects, and you focus on the sound qualities, and really looking at just maybe a bar at a time, or just a very, very small portion of the piece. In other words, you're focusing on the material, but you're not thinking about the trajectory. Where am I going to take the material? And you can get into trouble really quickly if you do that. One of the great dangers in composition, and not just for students, for everybody, is you fall in love with your material. You start to think the material is where it's at, and that's not true. The trajectory is what matters, not the material. The material is like the vehicle that gets you from A to B. And it has its importance, don't get me wrong, and you have to get the material right, and you have to have a sense of creating a compelling surface. Absolutely, that's really key. But the trajectory is more important. So how do you do that? Well, you have to conceive of a piece in terms of abstract movement, flow of energy and tension and dramaturgy and things like that. There are some exceptions to that. There are composers that really do not work that way. Morton Feldman, for example. But that's kind of a special case, I would argue. And for the most part, having a sense of the overall flow of events is pretty crucial. Ottavio Magnanis writes, how do you, by the way, I'm probably butchering everybody's name, so my apologies for that. How do you see the relationship between music and poetry? Do you think musical form can influence poetic form? Well, it's the same thing, actually. There's no significant difference for me between music and poetry, really. And I say that as somebody who has practiced both. I'm not a particularly accomplished poet, but I have written poetry and I've published it. And I've engaged very deeply with the world of poetry. And for me, there's very little difference. There's very little difference between the two. In poetry, there are patterns, there's rhythm, there's sound, there are structures, and then there's also this idea that you have a tension between the known thing, the familiar thing, and then the unfamiliar way or the unfamiliar context in which you are placing that thing, which is also a really central idea in composition. It's like the disconnect between a familiar element of language that is public property in a sense, and then the new and unfamiliar way that you're using it, the new context that you're creating. So there's a lot of similarities between the two. Do I think musical form can influence poetic form? That's an interesting question. Usually it's formulated the other way around. Do you think poetry can influence music? Well, I have to say, I know a lot of poets. I'm very fortunate to have amongst my friends some amazingly talented poets. Poets that I deeply admire. That's one of the great joys of my life, is that I'm privileged to know people like that. Most of those poets, with a few exceptions, their musical tastes seem to be more inclined towards popular music than anything like what I do, or 20th century music. There's a few exceptions to that, and some of them have very little interest in music at all, actually. So I don't know. It's hard to say. It's hard to say. You'd have to ask an individual poet what their relationship to music is. But, it's not surprising that there aren't a lot of composers that have a detailed understanding of the poetic traditions of the 20th century either, for that matter. So it runs in both directions. So, okay, there's a lot of questions here. Why do so many modernist composers take interest in Renaissance music? Webern, Varese, Ligeti, Fernehoe, Pert, etc. I'm also very interested in early music. I think there's, well, I can't answer it for them. I can only answer it from my point of view. I think that an artist will be interested in music of the past to the extent that it illuminates a present day problem or present day artistic concern. one of the things that is really very attractive about early music is that a lot of the grammatical substrata upon which the music of the 18th and 19th centuries is based was not yet firmly established. So the grammar was still changing and growing and ambiguous in many cases. There wasn't necessarily a what would you say? There are a lot of limit cases, things that are very hard to describe technically or theoretically because of that. And I think that's one of the things that's very attractive about that music is there's a sense of intense technical prospecting going on. You can sort of watch composers try things out in real time and listen to their spirit of experimentation, and it's very appealing. It's very appealing. Things weren't so codified, so. And I think there's a clear connection, I think, between that spirit of research, what happens if ... that kind of approach, and a lot of the things that happened in the 20th century, particularly the latter half of the 20th century. So, Tyler Vuman. Hey, Tyler. How are you doing? Nice to see you here. Fun question. Favorite Beethoven symphony? Well, I answered that at the beginning of this live stream. I guess you weren't here. It's my 8th symphony. It's the 8th symphony. Definitely. I love them all, but the 8th is a special favorite. So, yeah, I'm going to just make another quick announcement here that my new album is going to be coming out hopefully soon. But the release of it depends upon the successful completion of my crowdfunding campaign, which is currently underway. And so this has been going on for about a month now, and we're now down to 8 to 10 hours left, right? So this is that we're counting down 10 hours until the end of this crowdfunding campaign. It's an all or nothing campaign, which means that if the project is not funded, if the goal is not reached, the project will not be funded, and then it's basically back to square one as far as releasing the album is concerned, because it's very expensive to release an album and to pay for the production and all of that. So the crowdfunding is a necessary part of that. So we really want to hit this target. There's 10 hours left to do it. And there's a link that you can click on, which is in the description of the live stream. And I think I can also put a banner on the screen. There we go. It's on a website called wemakeit.com/projects. And you'll see it there. So if you haven't already, check that out. And if anyone here has already contributed, let me once again express my profound gratitude to everyone who has done that and everyone who has shared the link on social media. That's also a really helpful thing you can do if you are unable to support the campaign directly. You can really help by sharing the link or sending it emailing it to anybody that you think might be interested. So there's the link for the crowdfunding campaign. And once again, I want to say I'm really, really proud of these recordings. This was done with the Ensemble Proton Bern in Switzerland, with the wonderful conductor Luigi Gaggero, and also the soprano Pei Chen, who sang my new cantata on poems by the British poet Jeremy Halvard Prynne. So I would really like everyone to hear it. And if the crowdfunding campaign is successful, that means that there's that it'll be released within a reasonable time frame. If we don't reach the goal, then I'll have to start over again in terms of the financing, and it could take a lot longer to get the disc out. So there we go. So Mike, have you done a video on Claude Vivier? No, I haven't. It's almost too obvious, isn't it? Because I'm Canadian, of course, and yeah. I know a lot of people who knew Claude Vivier. I'm interested in the music. He was undoubtedly very gifted. Unfortunately, the particulars of his biography often overshadow the music, which I think is really a shame. He was really gifted. I haven't thought of doing a video on his work anytime soon, but I may do at some point. So, are you interested in writing an opera? This is from Franz Kern Biederstadt. Are you interested in writing an opera? And if so, would it be a literature opera with a with a straightly forward going action plot, or something more abstract like Elliot Carter's What Next? Das ist eine sehr interessante Frage. Yes, actually. I do have a project in the works. I'm not going to say anything about it for now, but I am planning to do something along those lines. It will be a long-term project. Stephen Watson. Hi, Stephen. When composing, to what extent do you rely on technique versus intuition? Oh, that's a fantastic question. I love that question, Stephen. Those two things are both necessary. They have to be in a certain equilibrium. And you can tell when you've gone too far on one direction or on the other. You know, if you're too focused on technique and your intuition is not functioning properly, then the music gets really stiff and inexpressive and dull. If you're relying too heavily on intuition and not on technique, you know, intuition is a funny thing, because I think what a lot of intuition is actually is your reservoir of undigested memories. You know, so the intuition is the faculty that unconsciously recalls things that you've already heard or already experienced. And perhaps, you know, to frame it slightly more charitably, there's also a dimension of an innate sense of balance or form or material, and something that's maybe harder to qualify. But those two things need to be in balance. When they're in balance with each other, you can tell, because you're doing things that are beyond the scope of what you can imagine. You know, if you're limited to doing things that you can imagine doing, then you're limited to the contents of your memory and your particular intelligence. It's good to use techniques that can sort of force you to expand those boundaries, to force you to do things that you would not come up with otherwise. So Henry, thank you for your contribution to the crowdfunding campaign. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful. I hope it goes through too. So, Adrienne Saavedra writes, part of the success of new ways of music performances is because the performers have a certain grade of involvement in the composition process. What are your thoughts? Well, I can only speak for myself. I like writing for people that I know. I love writing for friends. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I think there are quite a few composers that maybe write their best works when they know who's going to be performing. These are difficult things to qualify. I don't know exactly why that is, but I just wrote a 22-minute long cantata for Ensemble Proton Bern. I know every single member of that ensemble rather well, and I've been working with them forever, since the Big Bang. When I'm writing a piece like that, I'm always thinking in the back of my mind, oh, that's, you know, this line, this is Martin's going to play this, or Elise is going to play this bassoon line, or Bettina is going to play this on the bass flute, and so on. And I know how they play, and I know what they're like as people. And I'm not going to say that it directly affects the nature of the music I write. That would be probably too simplistic a conclusion to come to, but they're there in my mind when I'm writing. And the rehearsal process is intensive. It's very intensive, and I like to work with people that are personally invested, really personally invested in the process, which is probably one of the reasons why I tend to write a lot of chamber music and ensemble pieces. There's a sense of personal involvement, responsibility, engagement that is really strong. You can get that in an orchestra too, of course, but I think it's probably It's a different thing. It's a different kind of ecosystem. Balint Kawosi. Oh yeah, hi. How are you doing? It's nice to see you here. Have you composed for the pipe organ, or would you consider doing so in the future? Yes, actually, I have a project to write a piece for organ. I can't say too much more about it at the moment because it's under negotiations. But yes, that's something I'm hoping to do. I love the organ. I don't understand it well enough as an instrument, so it would take a fair bit of research. Unfortunately, I have some really gigantic, embarrassing gaps in my understanding of the organ. But I think, if I work closely with an organist, I can probably fill those gaps. Hopefully. An amazing instrument, isn't it? I'd also like to write for clavichord, but that's tricky. It would probably need to be amplified if it were to be played in an auditorium, because most clavichords, especially fretted clavichords, are very quiet instruments. And then there's the problem of combining it with other instruments, so it would probably have to be a solo piece, and it gets very complicated. I'm curious to know, actually, if anybody in the chat knows of any contemporary pieces that use the clavichord as an instrument. So I had problems to help through crowdfunding from my mobile. I will try again from PC when back home. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. I don't know. It should be possible to place a pledge on a mobile phone, but I've never tried. So if it still doesn't work, what you can do is send an email to hello@wemakeit.com, and they can help you with that, hopefully. But yeah, so just one second. So then, are you still playing oboe or 100% composer? Oh, I love the oboe. I just love the oboe and the entire family of oboe instruments. At the moment, I'm not playing, no. I wish I was, but I did do a tour in 2018 where I played quite a lot. I played my solo oboe piece, Locus Solus, in quite a few different cities. And I also recorded the piece, Verification. I played the musette part on that, on the Kairos CD of that piece. The musette is a piccolo oboe pitched in either E flat or F. And I've done quite a lot of oboe playing in the past, but no, I just I've got a complicated schedule. The oboe is a very physically demanding instrument, and at a certain point, also, the part of it is that my way of working is extremely intensive. My way of composing, it takes me forever to finish a piece. I really have to work hard, and I need to sort of be able to remain in that space of concentration, intense concentration. And I think that if I were actively giving concerts all the time and having to practice, and it would be very, very difficult for me to sustain that. There are other types of creative personas that are able to do it. I was in Basel a couple of weeks ago, and I saw Heinz Holliger, and he's in his 80s now. He's still playing, still composing, still conducting. It's absolutely phenomenal. I wish I could do that, but I just can't. I can't do it. I don't have his physical constitution, and I think also his way of writing is much more spontaneous and kind of gestural. So he's able to go off and write a piece in 2 weeks, working very, very intensively, and go off and do a concert and keep switching between all those activities, which I deeply admire, but I'm not able to do it myself. So Mario Rossi, hey Sam, could you do an analysis of Lily Boulanger, La Terre appartient à l'éternel? The finale is amazing. Well, I do have a video on Lily Boulanger, actually. I do have a video on one of her pieces. I'm sure I'll revisit her work at some point because I think she's really an extremely interesting figure. I don't know if it'll be that specific piece. I have an eye actually on her her late psalm settings. Those are really spectacularly beautiful. So Oh, you do have an amplified clavichord. That's very interesting. Yeah, if you have a chance, let me know how you amplify it. Is it with a contact microphone, I wonder? Or do you have a jack on it or something? Because I had a, my father, this might interest you, was really enthusiastic about the period instrument revival in the 1970s, and he bought one of those Zimmermann clavichord kits. This was probably in the late 70s, early 80s, something like that, and he built a clavichord. So there was one of these sort of handmade clavichords kicking around the house when I was a teenager, when I was a kid, and I used to play it all the time. So I have a real love for that instrument. And I remember I made a bunch of recordings when I was a teenager, which probably nobody will ever hear, although I've got them all digitized. But I did a lot of things with amplified clavichords and trying to combine it with different instruments. And anyway, maybe that will have a resurgence at some point in my work. I don't know. I love to listen to triadic memories, but don't like to read it at the piano. I love trying to read Ligoti's etudes, but I don't like to listen to them really anymore. Music can be enjoyable to read and to play. Yeah, that's true. Well, yeah, those Feldman pieces. He had such a weird approach to musical notation. The notation deliberately creates a distance between the performer and the instrument and the text. It's like you really have to think about what his intentions are, what he actually means by some of these strange note spellings and the odd way he notates his rhythms and so on. So you're constantly in this position of having to sort of understand what it is these notations mean and try to come to some kind of interpretive approach that makes sense. And it's very challenging. And those pieces are really super physically hard to play because you often have to maintain these very low dynamics for long stretches of time. So I can imagine those pieces would not be particularly fun to play, but I love listening to them. My favorite Feldman piece, by the way, is probably Patterns in a Chromatic Field for cello and piano. Magnificent piece on every level. If any of you have not heard Patterns in a Chromatic Field by Morton Feldman, get that right away. It's an amazing piece. So I get paid in about 3 hours. If the goal is still short, I'll more than happily put more down. Let's make this happen. Yeah, well, thank you so much. I'm really grateful. I'm super grateful for everybody who's making the attempt to do that. Thank you so much. And we're getting a little bit closer. We are at 63% now, which is amazing. I think we're going to make it. So much gratitude to everybody. And for those of you who would like to contribute but are not in a position to do so, I completely understand. And one thing you can do is, if you want to, you can share the link. That's really helpful too. Or you can just stream the album when it comes out, and that's great too. So, how much time is left on the? How much time is left on what? On the live stream or on the crowdfunding campaign? The crowdfunding campaign ends at 8:35 a.m. Central European Summertime, which is 2 in the morning Eastern Standard Time, and 1 in the morning Central. So super convenient time, of course, for everybody to end a crowdfunding campaign. Anyway, there's 10 hours left. So I'm tuning in late. I'm interested in how you understand or envision your significant presence with your YouTube videos as a part of your creative life. It seems central to not just what you do, but how you do it. Oh, that's a complicated question. I haven't quite sorted that out myself. The YouTube thing is very abstract to me because I know what the numbers are. I know that millions of people have seen the videos, but it's a hard thing to have a sense of the reality of that because I live in a small city. I don't interact with most of those people physically. And I also live in a French-speaking country. So, the people that that I tend to interact with on a daily basis are not Anglophones, and they're probably not watching the channel. So it's very hard for me to get a sense of who's watching and what kind of an impact it's having. I really don't know, except for the emails that I get and the comments and that sort of thing. It's certainly taken my life and my work in some surprising directions. That's for sure. But you may have noticed for those of you who've been following the channel for a while, I was commenting on my work a fair bit when I started. I was posting videos of my own compositions, and I did an analysis video of my piece, Vérification, and I've completely stopped doing that, and I'm actually very strongly disinclined to comment on my own work these days, except occasionally in interviews and things like that. But for the most part, I'm not doing it. I prefer to nurture the work itself and allow its ambiguities to radiate outwards, and not try to condition the reception of those works. I think other people can do that better than I can anyway. So, do you agree that composition competitions are biased because the great majority of the winners seem to come from the same places, North America, Western Europe, and Asia? Why only those nationalities? I'm not the person to ask because I have zero interest in composition competitions, and I regularly discourage my students from entering them. I think that they are scams mostly, and when they're not scams, they're not very beneficial to anybody, including the people that win them. Right? So there's this idea that a composition competition is in some manner analogous to the really major competitions that performers often have to enter in order to establish their careers, you know, the great piano competitions and violin competitions and so on. But they really aren't analogous to those, because winning a composition competition is not going to guarantee you a career in composition. You know, you can try this as an experiment. Look at the winners for virtually any major composition competition for the last 10 or 15 years or 20 years or whatever. And how many of them have major international reputations today? Some of them undoubtedly do, but it'd be interesting to see what the percentage actually is. I think it's a waste of time. I don't think composers should enter competitions. And I don't think it's an effective way to launch a career. Pourquoi pas de vidéo en français? C'est une bonne question. Je me permets de vous répondre en français. Alors, j'ai fait un entretien avec Hugues Dufour, le compositeur français, il y a quelques mois. C'est une vidéo qui a bien fonctionné, en fait, et tant mieux. Je suis un très grand fan de Hugues Dufour et de sa musique. Mais il faut savoir aussi que l'immense majorité de mes abonnés sont des anglophones. Donc, publier des vidéos en français, je ne suis pas sûr que ça soit nécessairement la meilleure façon de faire, sachant qu'en plus, je serais obligé de les sous-titrer, ce qui est souvent extrêmement chronophage et assez onéreux, parce que, bon, en général, il faut trouver un traducteur, il faut trouver quelqu'un pour faire les sous-titres. Et voilà, ça complique énormément, en fait, la production d'une vidéo. Donc, malheureusement... OK. Sorry. That's the end of that parenthesis. So... secret voodoo rhythms. The drummer of Can claimed to have learned secret voodoo rhythms. Do you have any idea what those rhythms are and why they were forbidden to perform? No, I have no idea. I have no idea about that story. It sounds a bit off to me somehow, but okay. Love your work, and I hope the campaign is a success. Can't wait to hear it. Oh, thank you, John. Thank you very much, John. I really appreciate the words. Is it possible to compose atonal music using thirds? Of course. Webern did that. Listen to the opening movement of the orchestra pieces, Opus 6. He has these beautiful chromatic harmonies in stacked thirds. Absolutely spectacular. Listen to the Drei kleine Stücke, the three little pieces for cello and piano. The first thing you hear is a dominant 11th chord, a kind of altered dominant 11th chord with an F sharp in the bass and the cello. And all of those chords are based on stacked thirds. It's an atonal piece, but yeah, there's this idea that atonal harmony has to be built on minor thirds and minor seconds, major sevenths, minor ninths, and stacked fourths and things like that, and tritones. And it's a caricature. You know, there's a huge range of harmonic effects that can be created, and you can use any interval you want. Tonality, by the way, is a complicated concept because there's a lot of components that go into it. It's not as simple as just having a key signature. You need to have the bass determine the function of the harmony. You have to have triadic harmony. You have to have diatonic scales. You have to have a leading tone concept of some kind. Modulation. There's a lot of things that go into determining whether a piece is tonal or not. So, are there any composers and/or pieces that you would consider overrated? I think the more interesting question is, what are the composers or pieces that are underrated? And there are quite a few of those, unfortunately. I tweeted about this earlier. The Schoenberg violin concerto is underrated. Hardly anyone seems to know that piece, but it's spectacular. It's so beautiful. Such a beautiful piece. Hilary Hahn, the violinist, made an incredible recording of that piece. It's, by the way, a courageous thing of her to have done, because you're taking a commercial risk when you record that kind of repertoire. It's not exactly a war horse, let's put it that way. And she paired it with the Sibelius, and it's a wonderful disc, an amazing disc. A part of the Marteau sans maître is all parallel minor thirds. Yeah, that's true. There's a comment actually by Brian Fernihoe about one of the movements of Le Marteau sans maître that starts with a minor third played on the guitar. And he said something like that opening sounds so strange. I've never been able to determine if it's a terrible mistake or a stroke of genius to have begun a movement that way. I always thought that was a funny comment. Do you have any advice for extending material? This is John Michael Walsam. Is it okay to allow a piece to remain short? It depends on what you're trying to do. If you're aiming to write a 10-minute piece and you can't get beyond 30 seconds, then that might be an indication that there's a problem. But there are lots of short miniature pieces that function perfectly well. I'm actually working on a video about that at the moment, which I'm hoping to post very, very soon. I'm going to be analyzing one of Webern's shortest compositions and talking about the difference between a miniature and a fragment. But no, there are some wonderful short pieces by Prokofiev, the Vision Fugitive. If there are any pianists here, you probably know those pieces. Those are wonderful works. But, you know, it's like a kind of sketchbook. They're very informal pieces. They have kind of a fragmentary, unfinished character to them. There's, of course, all the wonderful Schoenberg piano pieces that are typically very short. There are the Beethoven bagatelles. You know, the shortest piece Beethoven ever wrote was the Bagatelle Opus 119, number 10, which lasts for about 15 seconds, something like that. But it's a complete piece. It's not a fragment. It has a beginning, middle, and end. Isn't that funny? In just 15 seconds. So, do you think you can be a reasonably proficient composer without going full-time? Yeah, of course. Depends on what you mean by full-time, though. Composing is actually not one job. It's like 10 jobs in reality. So, you know, you can parse that up in different ways depending on what your circumstances are like. But most composers that I know write music, but they also teach. Some of them are academics. Some of them are performers. Some of them have rock bands. Some of them have, you know, work in record stores or do other retail jobs like that. You know, so it's. But I don't know too many people that just sit in a room for 16 hours a day and do nothing but write music. I know a couple of living composers that claim to do that, although I'm not actually sure how accurate that actually is. But virtually every composer I know does many things. And some of those things feed directly into their work as a creative artist, and some of those things do not. But I've spoken about this publicly on a number of occasions. I think that for most creative types, you have to be realistic about how many hours of really intense, productive, creative work you can do in a given day. And in most cases, it tends to be between 1 and 3 hours a day. So that leaves you some time to do other things. That's about what Stravinsky did. I think Stravinsky spent about 4 hours a day composing, something like that. There are naturally phases of the creative process that are extremely intensive and where you have to work without a break. And so, for example, if you're working on a big orchestra piece, then it's very, very time consuming. But only some of that time is going to be directly involved in the creation of the work itself. A lot of it will you'll be doing things like copying or orchestrating or working out material, but it won't all be making the same intensive demands on your creative faculties. So anyway, there's no reason why you can't work whatever between 1 and 4 hours a day on composition. If you did that every day for 10 years, you'd have a body of work. And then there are composers like Varese or Schoenberg who fell silent for decades at a time, writing nothing. Now, you wouldn't want that to happen. It's not a desirable outcome, and it was very hard for both of them. And there were tragic reasons why those silences occurred, but it's possible. So no, this idea that you sit in a room from 9 to 5 every day and write, I don't know too many people who do that. Do you yourself dabble in academia? Well, I don't dabble in anything. I do things full steam or I don't do them. I mean, I give it everything or I don't do it. And academia, no, I'm not interested in academia. I'm not an academic. I've never been an academic. I teach, and I'm very devoted to my students. And I have taught in academic institutions, but I'm not an academic in the sense that I do not actively pursue research, except for, well, it depends on how you want to qualify research, I suppose. I did a long podcast with the pianist Ian Pace about this topic. I think that framing creative work as research is plausible, but somewhat disingenuous. So usually pianist composers don't accept guitarists as real composers. Well, if anybody actually thinks that, they really need to seriously get a life, because that's pretty ridiculous. Do you think guitarists should be able to play piano and compose with it? You can compose on a triangle if you want. It doesn't matter. You can compose on an accordion. I don't care. It really doesn't matter. I had a student once who composed on a DAW, a DAW directly, and he would make these really sophisticated mock-ups of his pieces. And the mock-ups got to be so amazing in terms of the sound quality that he started to wonder if it was even necessary to have these things be performed live, that maybe they could just be sort of standalone electronic pieces in their own right. It doesn't matter, different people work in different ways. Why does Dutilleux sound so Dutilleux? What's your take on composers who seem to arrive at a signature sound and not change? Crumb also did this. Well, it happens to everybody to some extent, because you're a limited individual and you're not 10,000 people, you're one person. You have a limited knowledge and breadth of experience to draw upon, and you have inclinations and interests and things that you think are meaningful that are beyond your conscious control. You can't decide what to be interested in. It's the architecture of your perceptual faculties that does that. So as a composer, I think you have a duty to pursue the things that you think are the most meaningful and the most interesting. Hello from Ukraine. Hello to Ukraine. by the way. I really miss traveling to your country. I wish I could come back. I was supposed to go to Kiev in March, and very, very upset that that wasn't possible. And sending thoughts to everybody who's in Ukraine. Are there any composers in history who received their basic musical education as adults or were completely self-taught? Yes. Yes, there are. Actually, one of my teachers, Alain Gossin, a French composer, didn't begin seriously composing until he was over 18, I think. He talks about this actually in a book of interviews that he put out a few years ago. He started very late. His parents insisted that he pursue studies in, I think it was chemistry or math or something like that, and they were rigorously opposed to his becoming a musician, and so that delayed his entry into the world of composition. And he started very late, and he had to catch up very quickly to be on an equal footing with his contemporaries. But he wrote some wonderful pieces. It's definitely possible. It's harder, but it's possible. Is noise music a continuation of stochastic music? I don't see those two things as being related. I've been to concerts of noise music, by the way, quite a few of them. The reason for that is my uncle was the founder of one of the pioneering noise music bands in London, Ontario, a band called the Nihilist Spasm Band. He was the drummer. And their whole thing was they played on instruments that they built themselves, except for the drums. Everything else was built by them. And it was really quite a band. They never rehearsed. Everything was spontaneously improvised on the spot on these weird instruments that they built. And oh, thank you, Bennett. Thanks. I didn't even know it was possible to, well, thank you. Apparently it's possible to send me money during this live stream. If anyone else wants to do that, hey, I wouldn't be against it. That's super cool. Thank you so much. I was talking about noise music. So anyway, so I got to hear this band play live on quite a number of occasions. And it was just ear-splittingly loud. And then through the Nihilist Spasm Band, I met and also heard concerts by various Japanese noise music artists, such as Jojo Hiroshiga. And I learned a little bit about that kind of subculture. It was really interesting. There's something kind of masochistic about it. Like they play so loud and so aggressively that it's physically painful. At that point, I kind of have to, I can't really do it. I can't really do it. My ears and my hearing are really important to me. But I don't really see a direct link between that and stochastic music, which is a completely different thing. Oh, it's Michael Mossy. Mike, good to see you here. Thanks so much for the last lesson. Okay, yeah, so I teach composition on Zoom. By the way, if anyone's interested, you can get in touch with me about that. And Mike is somebody that I've worked with recently. So I love teaching composition on Zoom. I've been doing it for 6 years now, and I'm extremely fortunate to be able to work with a lot of really interesting composers in this way. So anyone wants to do that, get in touch. Do you think European audiences have a greater appetite for challenging modern pieces than American audiences? No, absolutely not. No, I think that it's about the same between Europe and North America. I think, though, that there are major differences in the arts infrastructures in North America versus Europe. I think that's where the difference lies. So in America, by and large, the predominant funding model is private patronage and not state support. And a lot of artists are working in some other unrelated field so that they can make a living, and then they do their work, their creative work, when they can. And that's a bit of a caricature, but then of course you also have figures like Philip Glass and Steve Reich and some younger composers as well, like Nico Muhly, that are just constantly busy and doing commission after commission, and that exists too, of course. But America doesn't really have this strongly developed state sponsorship model that is highly prevalent in Western Europe, particularly. So And by the way, I'm not prepared to argue that one or the other system is better than the other, although I suppose the European model has the advantage of being fairly stable, although there's always the constant danger that the subsidies that exist and the institutions that are state-funded could, be subjected to political pressure and could disappear. And that, in fact, did happen in the Netherlands a number of years ago, where there was a new government that came into power and completely leveled the funding for culture, and contemporary music was just absolutely devastated in the Netherlands when that happened. So, and also it's not like countries that have extensive state support for artists produce more and better artists. That's actually not true. There's a lot of things that get funded that probably should not get funded. And that's a whole other debate, though. Oh, thank you, Julian. That's really cool. Are you familiar with Theodore W. Adorno's writings on music? What is your opinion of Adorno and his critical approach to music? Are you influenced in any way by him? I'm not influenced by Adorno, partly because I read him actually relatively late. I completely ignored his writing for the most part when I was a student. Not willfully, it's just that I just never got around to it. I had other preoccupations, and I didn't. I didn't really engage with his works at that time. I've subsequently read a fair bit of Adorno, and so I'm of two minds about it. So on the one hand, as prose, as writing, I think it's brilliant. It's wonderful to read. It's got this sort of sparkling energy to it. It's like one insight rapidly following another, and just an incredibly interesting flow of ideas. He was obviously extremely brilliant and very creative. So I love writing them. I love reading those texts just as text. There's an article he wrote on Viennese culture. I think it's just called Vienna. That's one of the most amazing things I've read. But I completely disagree with a lot of his critical conclusions. So, the whole Schoenberg versus Stravinsky dichotomy that he develops is interesting, and there's some degree of validity to that, but it's also absurd, like self-evidently absurd in many respects. And anyone can see that in 5 minutes. Like, he talks about the sort of backwards-looking Stravinsky using these hollowed out Baroque and classical cliched forms, but look what happened with Webern after his Opus 21. He starts using classical forms again, overtly. It's very, very overt in the piano variations and so on. And it's the same phenomenon. There's not a huge difference. It's just that Stravinsky was writing triads and exploring this kind of pandiatonic language, and the Schoenberg and Webern pieces are chromatic. But they were both very much preoccupied with classical forms and their response to musical tradition. So I don't quite understand the argument on that level, although I'm sure a philosophy student would have something to say about that. So, hi Samuel, I heard the concert in Bern went well. Unfortunately, I couldn't come to listen to it since I had an important exam. I was wondering if you had any plans regarding other concerts in Europe. Yes, certainly there are many concerts in the works, and we are hoping actually to perform the pieces that we did in Bern when the CD comes out, if not before. And we've got a few things in the works about that, and you could it's www.samuelandreeff.com. How much do I charge for private Zoom lessons? So send me an email and I can send you a document that outlines the conditions and the rates. I'm not going to put that information out publicly, but you can request it by sending me an email, samuel.andreeff@gmail.com, and I will send you my information if anyone wants to study composition privately with me. So, I've heard Schoenberg being called the most classical composer. He was just pushing the limits of the classical tradition. It's complicated. Schoenberg was looking radically forward and very much backwards simultaneously. He's described by Charles Rosen as a radical conservative or conservative radical. It's hard to pigeonhole a composer like that. It's not easy. But yes, he was intensely aware of and self-conscious about tradition, his relationship to it, and his place within it, in a way that I think is probably rather exaggerated compared to other composers of the same period. What are your thoughts on John Adams? I don't have a lot of thoughts on John Adams. I don't listen to the music of John Adams. I have heard it, and I've chosen not to continue listening to it. That sounds a bit catty of me, doesn't it? Yeah. So, Stockhausen used to complain that the notation of dynamics was not precise enough. However, notating exact decibels, while more accurate, does not seem practical either. Any ideas on how to improve? Well, that's Stockhausen for you. Stockhausen, in one of his interviews, claims that he could tell the difference when he was mixing one of his pieces between... he would have a multi-track mix going on, and he would take one of the faders and move it up by half a decibel. And he would claim that he could tell the difference between the two mixes. He claimed to have these almost superhuman abilities of discretion in terms of his hearing. I can't disprove that. Maybe it's true, but it's kind of a ludicrous way to approach performance, I believe. And that's not a slight on Stockhausen. Stockhausen was a genius. He was a colossal creative artist. There's no question. But we really have to examine his legacy critically, I think, and not just take all of his pronouncements at face value. And he also said a lot of ridiculous things. This is something, so I've done 2 podcasts with the pianist Ian Pace, and there are a few things that came out of that I think are important, and that I would like, I hope people can hear. One of them was, Ian often talks about the fact that a lot of writing on music, particularly contemporary music, is actually thinly disguised promotional material. In other words, when a biography or a monograph on a contemporary composer is issued, very often it consists of nothing more than a rehash of the composer's own statements without any contextual information and without any critical response. So that in a lot of journalism about contemporary composition also is basically puffery. It's not substantial, and it's not a genuine critical engagement with the work. So I would certainly encourage people to exercise their critical faculties when they're reading the essays or the interviews of a composer. Composers are often very unreliable sources for information about their own work. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not really doing it anymore. I don't like to talk about my work. I don't like to write about it. And it's better that other people do that, and that they formulate their own opinions and their own critical positions and so on. What are your thoughts on Grize? Well, Grize was such a wonderful, creative, amazing artist in every respect. The works are uneven. I don't like all of them equally, that's for sure, but the strong works are incredible. He's a visionary, absolutely a visionary. I think the early days of spectralism in France were a period of wonderful creativity and exploration, and I just love those works. That's why I interviewed Hugues Dufour and spent 2 hours talking with him about that period. And of course, he knew Grize very well. My own work has gone in a completely diametrically opposed direction. But I studied in Paris, and I had a lot of contacts with spectral composers and the second generation of spectral composers as well. And I listened to a lot of the music, and I'm impressed by it. So here's another quick announcement for those of you who have joined us recently. So I am in the throes of a crowdfunding campaign for my new album, which is going to be released hopefully very shortly. But as a quick reminder, we need to meet our crowdfunding goal for this album in order to be able to release it. And there are 9 hours left to support the campaign. This has been going on since June 14th, and we are now at the very end of the campaign. We are at 64% of our crowdfunding goal. We need to get to 100% within 9 hours. And I think it's doable. There have been a lot of contributions coming in the last few hours, and I think we're going to get there. But if anybody among you does not know the link yet, I'm going to show it on the screen. It's on a website called wemakeit.com, and you'll find the link in the description of this streaming video. So what it is a new album of 4 of my most recent compositions that I recorded in Zurich, Switzerland, with the ensemble Proton Bern. These are close friends of mine, collaborators I've been working with for over 10 years, and also the conductor Luigi Guerrero, who is also a very close friend and has conducted a lot of my works. And I am so thrilled about this recording. I want everybody to hear these recordings of my pieces. I think I cannot imagine them being better played than on this album. And we took tremendous care over the production. And one more thing that I haven't really announced publicly very much so far, but we are hoping to do a double LP release of this. So the album should be released in 3 formats: CD, streaming, and double vinyl, which is something I'm really thrilled about also. But in order for all of that to happen, we need to meet our crowdfunding goal within 9 hours. So have a look at that if you haven't already done so. So, rough timing with the global inflation right now. Yeah, well, no kidding. It was hard to get this project funded. In fact, it's still not completely funded. That was a risk we took, and we decided to go ahead with the project and just do it and hope that things work out. So I know you've been saying you don't like talking about your own work, but how would you categorize your style? Well, that's just the thing. I wouldn't categorize it. I wouldn't categorize it. Other people can do that if they want. So Merrick is on this chat. Hi, Merrick. What's your story with the Casio SK1? Do you consider using different synths or keyboards for your future projects? No, I'm just going to use the Casio SK1 for the rest of my career. I love the Casio SK1. You know, I'll show you. My office is in a bit of a mess right now, but I've got all these keyboards behind me. Maybe you can see them. There's a bit of a lag here on the stream, so let me see. I'm trying to show you. There's a big pile of these keyboards behind me. These Casio keyboards. I've got like 10 or 15 of them. So the story with the SK1. The story is that when I was 14 years old, I had a friend in school who had a Casio SK1 keyboard, and I was starting to write my own music, and I was playing the cello at the time, and I was just obsessed with music and obsessed with, experimenting with musical instruments and trying to get as many different sounds as I could and making these recordings in my parents' garage and stuff like that. And anyway, so my friend had this Casio SK1 keyboard, this little, 2.5 octave mini keyboard. And I was just fascinated by it. I thought, wow, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen. It's got all these presets. You can make all these different sounds, and you can even do sampling on it, like really primitive, low resolution sampling. But, for 1985, which is when that instrument was introduced, it was pretty amazing that you could get something that could do all of those things at that price point. It's like there was no other instrument on the market that could do that at the time. And the thing I love about the Casio SK1, so I bought it from him for $20 and took it home and just, I worked with it for years, making all these sort of recordings in the garage of my parents' house. And it's an instrument that's just burned into my mind and my personal biography forever because of the amount of time I spent with it. And then, I don't know, when I was 17 or 16 or something, I stopped using it and got, some higher grade keyboards, put the Casio in the attic and never looked at it again until one time I was visiting Canada in 2010 maybe, or 2011 or something like that, probably 2010. And I remember there was this Casio up in the attic, so I went and got it, and it still worked. So I took it back to France, and I thought, well, it would be really cool actually to take this thing, which is kind of, it's like it's between an instrument and a toy. It's like not exactly sophisticated enough to be an instrument, so to speak, but it's also, you know, it's a pretty sophisticated instrument. It's not just a toy. So that, wouldn't it be cool to put this in a piece and to treat it as seriously as you might treat a concert grand piano? Like really take it seriously. Like what is the maximum amount of subtlety, expressivity, and musicality that you can get out of a Casio SK1 keyboard? So that was an interesting challenge. And I like doing stuff like that because it's a limited instrument. It's got real limitations. And so you have to try to, you're forced to see like how close can I get to the very limits of what this thing can do. And so I've used it in 3 pieces for that reason, because I know it really well, but I'm also, you know, always curious to know, can I take it a bit farther in the next piece? That's more interesting to me than, of course, I could run out and get a keyboard that can do, you know, anything, and it would be really sophisticated and have 20,000 presets and so on. But it's the limitations that are interesting to me. The most hilarious composers for you? Oh, that's an interesting question. The most hilarious composers? Percy Grainger comes to mind. He's pretty funny. I like Percy Grainger. Prokofiev, also, the Classical Symphony is really quite funny, I think. I love that piece. It's also really beautiful, too. Hard to do something that's both beautiful and funny at the same time, but he manages it. Actually, someone in the chat has written, I've not seen you talk about Prokofiev before. Do you see him as an innovator? Any thoughts on the violin concertos in particular? Sure, yeah, he was an innovator, definitely. You know, we often have this historiography of 20th century music that focuses on the most extreme radical innovators and values composers proportionally to the extent of their innovations, which I think is a huge mistake, because it forces you to leave composers out of that narrative, such as Hindemith, Prokofiev, Sibelius, Janacek, who are just as distinct and in many cases very, very much innovative, although perhaps not as outwardly radical as the ones that are perceived as having pushed the art of music into new territory. So, no, I love Prokofiev. So there's a well-known quote from Ezra Pound's ABC of Reading: music rots when it gets too far from the dance. Yes, poetry atrophies when it gets too far from music. Yes, I know. I love the ABC of Reading. It's a wonderful book. Someone should do something equivalent for music. It's not going to be me, but wouldn't that be great? Although Stravinsky's Poetics of Music comes close, that's also very good. What's your relationship to dance music? Well, all of my music is dance music to some extent, in the sense that it consists of embodied rhythms. And increasingly to pulsed rhythms. And the pulses are sometimes, well, often irregular, but the pulses are there nonetheless, and they relate to embodied bodily corporeal movements. And that is absolutely fundamental. Rhythm is more important than pitch in music, as far as I'm concerned. It affects us more profoundly and more immediately than pitch. Rhythm is the foundation. It's the ground of music, and it's absolutely vital. So I need there to be a strong rhythmic component to music. So, thoughts on writing new music for period instruments such as viola da gamba and Baroque flute? Well, yeah, so I was actually asked to do something like that once. Someone asked me to do a piece that would blend period instruments with modern instruments, and I refused the commission because I thought that would be incredibly complicated to do, and I wasn't convinced I could do it. There are composers who have done such things. Many composers have written pieces for Baroque ensembles. Then there's the famous Ligeti piece for solo harpsichord, Continuum, which is a quite extraordinary reimagining of the harpsichord and its technique. My friend Betsy Jolas has written a piece for Baroque ensemble, also, that is quite a beautiful piece. But it's not something that tempts me particularly. I think I don't know. Those instruments have their repertoire, and it's for me in my mind's ear. They're so inextricably linked with that repertoire that I almost can't imagine having them speak other lines. It's like sort of like an actor that's been typecast, and you know them in a particular role, and it just doesn't quite work if you see them in a different role. I don't know. Though there are a few composers who have done it. There's a magnificent piece by the Swiss composer Klaus Huber called Die Seele muss vom Reiter steigen. The soul must dismount from its horse and walk on its feet of silk. It's on poems by Darwish, and it's a double concerto for baritone. Baritone, the string instrument that was used by Haydn, and cello, and also countertenor. It's a bizarre piece, but magnificent, and it uses a number of Baroque instruments in the ensemble, mixed with contemporary instruments. So, have you met the Percussion de Strasbourg, and would you like to work for them? Yes, I know them. I live in Strasbourg, of course, and I've been to many of their concerts, and I know the organizational team. And there was, in fact, a project to do a piece with them, and for various reasons, mainly to do with my schedule and the number of projects that I already had going on, it did not materialize. So, writing for percussion ensemble is a particularly difficult challenge, and I think part of the reason why I didn't pursue that opportunity more strenuously is that I wasn't sure what I would do. And I had other projects that were more immediate, maybe, let's say. So I can't believe how many questions there are, and everybody's asking amazingly interesting questions. So that's really cool. I want to also just thank everybody who's listening, who's watching. And, I haven't done one of these. I haven't done a live Q&A for a long time. And part of the reason for that was I did 2 or 3 of them during the pandemic, and I enjoyed doing them, but I had a lot of technical difficulties. And the last 2 that I did, I think there was, I couldn't get the live stream to work properly. There was no video, and it was just technically really complicated. And I had not a very good internet connection at the time also. So I just kind of abandoned the idea, but it seems to be working again. So maybe I can do this on a more regular basis. So, could you say something about the music of Thomas Adès? Oh, well, I admire the work of Thomas Adès. I enjoyed his piano concerto. That, it's important to pay attention to pieces like that. That is a smash hit, that piece. It's got, within months of its completion, it had, I don't know how many performances, dozens of performances lined up all over the place. And we don't have a lot of figures who can do something like that, who can make a composition that will have that breadth of distribution and that size of an audience. And we need figures like that in our culture. And he's a brilliant composer. So thank goodness for that. As a percussionist, I agree. It's pretty difficult to write for percussion ensemble. Yeah, right? It's hard. And there's lots of bad pieces for percussion ensemble. Dozens and dozens of them. And there's very few really good ones. So there are some high watermarks for sure, but I wouldn't want to write another kind of average percussion ensemble piece that gets played once or twice, and then I don't want to do that. I would want to do something that I would think would have a chance of being played a bunch of times, multiple times, and that would be a strong contribution to the genre. And if I thought that was going to take a really long time, then it would have to wait until I felt ready to do it. Interesting people are usually too busy to chat on Livestream. They usually need an excuse. Okay. I can't say anything about that. Ever thought of composing music for daily activities, such as kids' lullabies, school hymns, educational music, religious, etc.? That is a wonderful thing, it spills over. It's like there's a gray zone between composition and sound design. And sound design is an increasingly important thing in our societies, because just the little sounds you hear in the train station when your train arrives, or when you're in an airport, those little sounds you hear to alert you to your gate being about to close or whatever, these little chiming sounds and things like that, or the sound that you hear on your computer when you start it up. Those are, some of those things are like 4 seconds long, but they have to be composed. They have to be designed and composed. And Brian Eno did that. He wrote the startup sound for Windows. I can't remember if it was Windows 95, doesn't matter. But he had to make many, many, many iterations of it, and he worked on it for weeks, making these little miniature compositions, these like little 4 or 5 second compositions. And it's not something I've been approached to do, but I can imagine that being a really fascinating challenge for sure. As for kids' lullabies, I have a kid, and we sing together all the time, and she's really musical. But I don't know how easy it is to just write a lullaby. I think of lullabies as being a kind of a collective endeavor, something that's almost beyond authorship. Although, of course, you can immediately point out to me that the Brahms lullaby was composed by one person and everybody knows it. So, do you think composers can do themselves a disservice by being overly prolific? You turned me onto a cage percussion piece I quite enjoyed, but I couldn't imagine digging through his entire catalog. Yeah, I know what you mean. I know what you mean about that. There are composers where I kind of think, well, if they'd written 25% less, then they might have been doing their listeners a favor, because there'd be maybe the quality of the remaining works would have been slightly higher. But it doesn't work that way. Some people just have this really almost compulsive need to write all the time. And they can't write the strong pieces unless they write the weak ones. They have to work through them. And then every now and then there'll be a really strong piece that comes out of that. So it's not something you can control exactly. It's a matter of creative temperament. Then you have artists like Grize, who we talked about earlier, who had this very slow, painful, deliberate way of working, and it could take him years to finish a piece. Ligeti, you think about the 10 years that Ligeti spent trying to finish his piano concerto. Imagine that, that span of time on one piece. It wasn't all he was doing, but still. Or the incredibly slow progress that Varese made on his pieces after the 1920s. The Espace project that he worked on for decades, which eventually morphed into Désert, that magnificent late piece, but it took absolutely forever. I suppose by temperament, I have a preference for composers with a relatively small catalog, but one of very, very high quality. There's a comment I once read about Ravel, that he had a very small catalog, but every single one of his pieces is in the repertoire. He wrote no bad pieces. There are no minor Ravel works. Everything he wrote is wonderful, worth listening to, and regularly performed. It's rare, but it's an amazing achievement. Do you hear electroacoustic compositions? If yes, could you name some works that are enjoyable? I'm not the person to ask about that. I studied electroacoustic music for several years, and I've heard many electroacoustic pieces, but for one reason or another, I'm just not particularly drawn to the medium. I don't particularly enjoy electronic sound. I love acoustic instruments. I love instruments being played and hearing their vibrations propagated in the air, in the space, in the room that I'm in. I love that. Electronic sound is not something I feel particularly close to as a composer. It feels like it's been freeze-dried to me. But that's just what I'm saying now. And if you ask me tomorrow, I might answer that question very differently. One of the most beautiful compositions I've heard for percussion ensemble has voice included with it, and it was Ligeti's Sipal Dopal. Yeah, I can't pronounce the last word, but I know the piece you mean. I was talking with Unsuk Chin about that piece. We both agreed it's one of his most wonderful compositions. That's an amazing piece, isn't it? Really beautiful. He was writing wonderful music right up to the end. And the recent work of Kurtag, incidentally, His opera on Endgame by Samuel Beckett is quite amazing. Quite amazing. If any of you have a chance to hear that. So let's see. Do you have an opinion on why artists and bands can create a few really brilliant works and then for some reason everything they produce after a point for the rest of their careers is banal or hollow? That's kind of a big question. The devil is really in the details. It depends on who you're talking about. There are authors who produce one book, To Kill a Mockingbird, for example, and then that's it. Or J.D. Salinger is another example. And then it's either the public attention that gets to them, or they can't meet their own standards and they never publish anything else. And happens to composers too, where they have a period of intense productivity and they can't sustain it for whatever reason. Human beings are complex and they have private lives, and sometimes the private lives make it difficult for them to work for one reason or another. Life is difficult. They can't get their lives together, or they suffer from depression, or they have catastrophic personal circumstances, or whatever. People can be damaged in so many different ways and find it impossible to continue. When you think about it, the conditions necessary to create a work of art on a high level, those are very particular conditions to be able to sustain that focus, that level of creative investment. It's difficult. Most of the time, the conditions are not there. We live in an indifferent or hostile or both universe that is full of things trying to kill us all the time. And the fact that anybody could have the opportunity to sort of go away for a few months or whatever, a few weeks, and write something and be sheltered from all of that, and have all of the necessary scaffolding in place socially and financially and emotionally, and have a support network, and have people to play the pieces and to listen to them is amazing. It's an amazing achievement of our human societies that's even possible at all. So I think the question is, like, how do those high water marks appear in the first place, rather than why don't they occur more often? It's a miracle when something artistic on that level happens. It's a miracle that we have things like that at all. The odds are not in favor of it happening. So, was the album cover of The Tubular West inspired by Schoenberg's sketch for self-portrait walking? No. No, I know the painting you mean. It has nothing to do with that. No. There's a funny story about the album cover for The Tubular West. Let's see if I can... Actually, no, I can't really share it here, but I don't know. It's easy enough to look up. So The Tubular West is an album that I did in 2013. It's a very strange album, and the cover image is a watercolor painting of a street. It's actually the street that I grew up on in Toronto. And what happened was I was walking back from school one day when I was 12 or 13 or something, and I found this huge box of papers that was put out for the trash. And one of my neighbors was an elderly woman who had died, and her family threw out all of her belongings. And she had been a commercial artist and a watercolorist, and they threw everything out. So there was just boxes of these watercolors. And one of the watercolors was a depiction of the street that I grew up on in the 1950s that she had painted. And it showed a man standing right in the middle of the street doing this kind of ludicrous pose. And I thought that was such an amazing image. So we took it home, and my parents had it framed, and it was sitting in our living room for 20 years or something. And after we finished recording The Tubular West, with the sort of producer of the album, Steve Venwright, and I, we were discussing, well, what should we put on the cover? We tried out a bunch of ideas, nothing seemed right. And I thought, well, what about that image of the street I grew up in Toronto in the 1950s? And that ended up being the cover. So that's the story. It's a peculiar image, but I really love it. So Let's see now. Are you familiar with the music reviewer, The Needle Drop? Anthony Fantano, the internet's biggest music nerd. Yeah, I've seen some of his videos. He's a master of the YouTube format. What can I say? He's really good at it. I'm not interested in the critical content of his videos, but I see him as a product of the YouTube era and of this new format, and somebody who's been brilliant at seizing upon that and using it in a way that is really quite impressive. But yeah, I don't take his critical judgments at all seriously, though. That's a separate question. It's entertaining, he's fun to watch. What can I say? Sometimes that's what you want. You just want something that's fun to watch. It's not necessarily about anything else other than that. So, do you believe the Clarinet De Morae will catch on among other clarinets at some point, or do you think it will remain solely a pet project of Richard Haynes for the next decade or so? I think it's unlikely that it will remain an instrument that is exclusively used by Richard Haynes. I kind of doubt that. Partly because the manufacturer that produced that instrument has invested quite a lot in its development. So they now have a prototype that can be copied and that could potentially become a production instrument. For those of you, by the way, who don't know what I'm talking about, the Clarinet De Morae is an 18th century instrument that was briefly rather popular in Europe, but that never particularly attracted any kind of repertoire. I think there's a few instances of it being used in operas and things like that, but there's no substantial repertoire for this instrument, and it was forgotten mainly because the basset horn is a very similar instrument that did become popular and for which Mozart wrote a number of works, and so the Clarinet De Morae was simply forgotten. It fell into oblivion. But I knew about this instrument because I'm a sort of fanatic of woodwind instrument history, and I knew that the Clarinet De Morae had existed, but of course there were no modern instruments existing. So I was talking with my friend Richard Haynes about this once. He's a brilliant clarinetist, and we were both thinking, well, wouldn't it be cool to resurrect the Clarinet De Morae and make a modern version of that instrument? And what would it sound like? So he went and commissioned one from Schwenken Segelke, which is a German clarinet maker. And now we have this instrument, and it sounds incredible. It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. You have to hear this thing. I'm sure it'll remain probably an uncommon color in the spectrum of clarinet instruments for sure. I don't see it being a common instrument anytime soon. But I'd be fairly certain that other clarinets will take it up. So, and it doesn't take a lot of advocates for an instrument like that to develop a repertoire and to catch on. If you got 3 or 4 players taking it seriously, then you can get a foothold in the repertoire. The same thing happened with the Heckelphone. Like 2 people wrote for it, 3 people wrote for it, and it still exists for that reason. That's all it took. So, do you see a major return to tonality in the Western musical canon? Tonality never went anywhere. Tonality doesn't need to return because it never disappeared in the first place. This narrative that we always hear that tonality eventually got eroded by increasing amounts of chromaticism, and then it was compromised beyond repair by the early 20th century and so on. It's often presented with this air of kind of historical inevitability, this kind of teleological vision of music history, that it's always inclining towards this ultimate endpoint. But that's a very partial and selective view of music history. And most composers in the 1920s and 1930s were not writing atonal music. It was not the default position to take. But it's easy to have that impression, perhaps, because the really radical pieces get a lot of attention. So tonality never actually did go anywhere. George Gershwin and Schoenberg were great friends. Something worth thinking about. Kevin Chen, hi Sam, I hope you've had a great day. Thank you, Kevin. I hope you're having a great day too. I'm having a very good day, and I'm really enjoying this chat, and I'm really enjoying all of these questions and interacting with all of these incredibly interesting people. And thank you all for being here. I recall you planned on doing a video judging student compositions. When do you plan on releasing it? Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. I've been meaning to post something about that, actually, because yes, it's true. I put out a call for scores. I think it was in April, actually. It was a while ago, from student composers, and suggested choosing 5 or 6 of them or something like that, and doing a video talking about them and offering hopefully some constructive remarks about the pieces. And I haven't published the video yet. The reason for that is I had an unbelievably crazy schedule of releases on my YouTube channel. I was doing a video every 2 weeks at one point. I did a lot of interviews. I was extremely busy with the album project also that I've mentioned a few times, and the preparations for a premiere involved with that. And teaching and everything else I do. And that particular video I didn't end up doing in the time frame that I had hoped, because it ended up being quite a lot more time consuming than I had imagined. And I just kept not being able to do it, unfortunately. And I really regret that, because I got some very interesting pieces. I may still do it. I hope I can. It's partly also a question of finding a format, I think, for that video that would be appropriate, because it's very difficult to say meaningful things about anybody's compositions without having a discussion with them, without taking the time to look at the pieces really closely. And the format of video I was hoping to do was something where I'd spend maybe 5 or 6 minutes on each piece, but I think it might be difficult to be genuinely helpful and insightful about a composition if I have to look at it that quickly. So it's still something I'm hoping to do. I haven't quite figured out yet how I'm going to do it. So anyone who has sent in their scores, thank you for doing that. I appreciate your patience. I'm sorry for the delay, and I really hope I can do it. So I can't believe how many questions there are. How do you feel about your music, and what place would you like it to have in the culture, and what do you like your audience to take from your music? There's a poet I really like who I've been working with called Jeremy Halvert Prynne. And he's known for writing really difficult to read poetry, although I think it's actually not quite as difficult as its reputation. He describes his poetry as being unicorn flavored. I've thought about that a lot. So I have a daughter, and her favorite type of ice cream is unicorn flavored ice cream. It's this kind of blue ice cream that you can get in some parts of Europe, unicorn ice cream. So I'll leave it at that. I think my music is unicorn flavored. I'm going to borrow Jeremy Halvert Prynne's comment on his poetry. My compositions are unicorn flavored. So, Tomas, what do you think about NFTs and the digitalization of classical music? Yeah, the NFTs are certainly an interesting phenomenon. They get a lot of attention because there were some artists that became extremely wealthy as a result of, of being early adopters of the NFT format and being very successful at it. But I think that those degrees of success are probably not reproducible, or at least not in any kind of consistent manner. I think it's consistent with what tends to happen when there's a new format or a new medium that occurs, and then there's a kind of fascination for it and a kind of a bandwagon-like piling onto that format, even before it's obvious, what its strengths and weaknesses are. It's too early to say, and technology is changing at such blinding speed that it's just, I don't know. Who knows if NFTs will be a thing in 5 years? Maybe they'll still be around in 200 years. I have no idea. I don't know. I've spoken with a few people about projects for making musical NFTs and things like that, and it's certainly an interesting concept, but I'm not involved with it personally. I know a bunch of poets that are producing NFT poetry and NFT visual poems as well. and having some success with that. So let's see. Hi, Samuel. Good day. This is from Alex. What do you think about form in music? How important is it for you as a composer? Greetings from Poland. Greetings to Poland. I've never visited your country. I wish I could. I'd really like to come to Poland someday. How important is form? Well, it's kind of like asking, how do you feel about your skeleton? How important is your skeleton to you? You'd look pretty funny if you didn't have a skeleton. What can I say? It's a hard question to answer. I can't very easily divorce the concept of form in music from the concept of material. There's a wonderful essay from the American poet Charles Olson, Projective Verse, which is included in a compilation of his essays called The Human Universe. A wonderful piece of writing. Every poet reads this essay. It's extremely famous. Projective Verse by Charles Olson. And one of the things he says in that essay is that form is never anything more than an extension of content, which means that form is not some abstract thing that you can just sort of create independently of a piece, of a poem or a composition, and then just fill it with content. The form emerges as a result of the content. So it's not something that I think about in the abstract very much. To some extent, you can plan out a composition in terms of its formal articulation. You can start out by saying, I'm going to write a piece in 4 movements, and the movements are going to be approximately this duration, or I'm going to do a sequence of short movements, or I'm going to do maybe one big long piece with a bunch of sections or something like that. That's a matter of articulation, I suppose, and proportion. But it's so intimately connected with the materials and with the whole poetic, expressive world of the piece that it's hard to talk about form independently of the other musical parameters. Hey, Christian's here. Christian Mitchum. There you go. Nice to see you, Christian. That's so cool. So many people I know showing up in this chat. So Christian says, hi, Samuel. I was reading about Charles Ives' comments on manner and substance in music. If you're familiar with his use of these terms, how would you best describe music of substance? That's a hard question to answer. I don't know. I'd have to refresh my memory. I'd have to look at those Charles Ives essays again. I don't know exactly what he means by that, so I can't really comment. Sorry. But next time we talk, maybe we can get into that subject. So oh, Matthias there. Oh no, I missed the live stream. Well, you haven't missed the live stream because it's still going on. Hope you're doing well, Samuel. I hope you're doing well, Mattia. Do you know any compositions for Fender Rhodes? Oh yes, you're writing for Fender Rhodes, aren't you? I would love to see you compose for it. Greetings from Berlin. Greetings from Strasbourg. Compositions for Fender Rhodes. The Spectralists have written for Fender Rhodes. I'm pretty sure Hugues Dufour wrote for it on a number of occasions. I have to double check that, but I think there's a Fender Rhodes part in Saturne, which is one of the great early spectral pieces. That's the first thing that comes to mind. But other than that, I can't think of anything right off the top of my head. I'm sure there are lots of composers who have used it, though. So, okay, one more plug then for my crowdfunding project. Let's have a look now. So this is really cool. There's been quite a few new contributions coming in over the course of the stream. I really have to express my gratitude to everyone who's been helping out with that. That's really fantastic. We're at 64% of our fundraising goal, and it's going up rapidly, so I think we're going to make it. I'm really, really excited about this. For those of you who may have joined us more recently, you might want to know that I'm doing a crowdfunding campaign for my new album that we are hoping to release in 3 formats: double vinyl, CD and streaming audio, and I'm really, really pleased with this recording. And we did a crowdfunding campaign for it because, as you can imagine, these sorts of projects are incredibly hard to finance these days, and the financing for this project is still not in place, even though the recording has already been recorded. So we're doing a crowdfunding campaign to try to meet some of the expenses involved in releasing it. And it's an all or nothing campaign, which means that if we do not meet the target by the deadline, then the project will not be funded, and everybody who has contributed so far will be refunded. So we're going to hope that that doesn't happen, and I think we're going to meet the goal, but there are only 8 hours left. So if you want to help make this project a reality, if you want to be a part of it, there are many different reward tiers that we're offering. You can get your name in the CD booklet, and you can get your name in a YouTube video. You can even get handwritten manuscripts. You can get an hour conversation with me, all kinds of things. So you can check those out. There's a link in the description of this stream. And we have many reward tiers from 20 Swiss francs, which is about equivalent to 20 US dollars, all the way up to 1,000, which, okay, let's be real, probably no one's going to take that. I know it, but who knows? Could happen. Anyway, have a look at that. And if you are not in a position to contribute, that's totally fine. You can also send the link out or share it on social media. That would be really helpful too. Anyway, there's 8 hours left to go. So now's a good time if it's something that you want to do. So, Kevin Chen. Hi, Kevin. I was wondering if you could recommend any books about Webern's music. I've been reading a book by Catherine Bailey as a start. Yeah, Catherine Bailey has 2 books on Webern. Webern Studies, and also there's a short biography of Webern that she wrote. She's an authority on Webern for sure. Very insightful writer. Those are very good books. I recommend, if you read French, there's a fantastic biography by Alain Gaillard on Webern that was published by Fayard, Fayard, which is a French publisher that does amazing biographies on composers, including many 20th century composers. And he wrote an outstanding work of scholarship on Webern that updates the biography in many crucial ways. And it's a brilliant book. So there's that. There's also a book called Webern and the Lyric Impulse by Anne C. Schreffler. Anne C. Schreffler is a musicologist who I believe is a professor at Yale. I could be mistaken about that. I think it's Yale or Harvard. No, it's Harvard. And that's also a brilliant book. It focuses on Webern's settings of poems by Georg Trakl, the Austrian expressionist poet. That's a brilliant book. Then there's Webern and the Transformation of Nature, which is a very interesting book, also by I believe an English musicologist that I remember really enjoying. There's lots of good books on Webern. The ones that I like are the ones that attempt to set straight the reality of what Webern's project actually was, and that shy away from all the standard cliches about this sort of cerebral 12-tone music. And there's far too much of that kind of writing. I'm not very interested in it, and I'm completely uninterested in pitch analyses of Webern compositions, of which there are endless numbers, and they often don't really tell you very much about the music. But people that try to engage critically with the poetic substance of Webern, what he was really trying to do, and that also can develop analytical frameworks for understanding his work that are not exclusively focused on pitch, are always of interest to me. So there you go. Thoughts on the composer Toru Takemitsu and his relationship with his Japanese cultural roots? Do you think a composer bears a responsibility in expressing their cultural background? I'm not sure that it's exactly a question of responsibility. I think it's something that occurs whether you want it to or not, because your subjectivity is inevitably conditioned by the culture that you grow up in. I don't know how you can possibly avoid that. It's partly a question of language too. The acquisition of language early in your life, the language that you hear when you're growing up, all of that is of crucial importance. It's more important than the question of belonging to this or that country, incidentally. You know, nationalistic questions are not very interesting to me, and the formation of a kind of nationalistic approach to musical canons, I think, is rather problematic, to say the least. But language is very important. Language conditions our approach to music, I'm sure, in all sorts of complicated ways. So, thoughts on Carl Nielsen? Yeah, you know what? Honestly, I have trouble with Carl Nielsen. I've listened to the music. My wife and daughter are both Danish citizens, so I suppose I ought to be more knowledgeable about Carl Nielsen than I am, because he's one of their great folk heroes, of course. But I have trouble with the music. There's aspects of it that I find very interesting. There's a kind of stream of consciousness, very kind of freewheeling, improvisatory approach to inventing musical material and not necessarily developing it. Some of the symphonies are quite impressive. The Fourth Symphony is an impressive piece. The Clarinet Concerto is quite beautiful, but there's also something in the expressive world of those pieces that I find completely alien and very difficult to connect with. So I don't know, but I keep coming back to it periodically, and I may revise my opinion on Nielsen. We'll see. Someone I'm also kind of interested in right now, who's got some points in common with Nielsen, is the Italian composer Malipiero, who nobody talks about. When is the last time you ever heard the word Malipiero pronounced in musical circles? But that's an interesting composer. I'm actually tempted to do a video about him at some point, but the problem is like 3 people will watch it because it's Malipiero and nobody talks about him. But he's an interesting figure. So I'm probably going to sign off in about 5 minutes, saying this is my 5-minute warning. I've been going for a while now, and this has really been really enjoyable. But I'll do it again. So let's see, do a few more questions here. What are your thoughts on the use of quotations in music, such as in Berio's Sinfonia? Yeah, well, that's an extremely old thing. I mean, the La Folia, that old melody, was quoted by so many composers, Beethoven and Corelli and so on, and it appears everywhere. There are quotations in Bartók and quotations in Mozart and quotations in Beethoven, and it's hard to think of composers that never quote other composers' works, actually. Bach did it all the time. I don't know. I can't generalize about it because it's such a widespread and common phenomenon. So let's see now. Use a clickbait title, The Unknown Italian Composer They Don't Want You to Hear. Yes, that's right, isn't it? That would work. That would probably get more than 3 views. Okay, I owe you a royalty if I end up doing that. So, on average, how much music do you listen to per day? Oh, that's a good question. Oh, it's hard to say. I listen to a lot of music, but with varying levels of concentration. So, for example, I usually put music on when we're having dinner at home, all sorts of things, rock music, classical music, jazz, whatever, blues, anything. And then I listen to music on my bike all the time. I do a lot of biking around Alsace, and whenever I have to walk somewhere or bike somewhere, I'm usually listening to something. And I listen to my students' compositions on a virtually daily basis. I'm going to point out once again, I mentioned this earlier in the stream, but I do private teaching on Zoom. If anyone's interested, you can get in touch with me by email, or you can send me a note on Twitter or whatever, and to hear more about that. But I do offer private composition tuition and also analysis tuition on Zoom if anyone's interested. Anyway, so I listen to my students' compositions, and of course, if I'm making an analysis video on a composer, I tend to listen to their entire catalog. And I listen to the work that I'm analyzing many, many, many times. And I'm constantly listening to things that other composers are recommending, or students or people on YouTube. You know, people email me all the time with either their own work or things that they recommend I listen to, and I often do. I often listen to it. I can't always do it, but I often do. And so honestly, it's just such a big part of my day. I can't even begin to imagine how many minutes, how many hours a day I'm listening to music. So what modern British composers do you admire? Lots and lots of them. I'm a huge admirer of the British contemporary music scene. There are so many amazing, unique figures in British music. And the thing that I really find impressive also is there doesn't seem to be any particular aesthetic ideology that's prevalent in Britain in terms of music. So you get a really wide range of styles being practiced. You know, what other country has figures like Oliver Nussin, Brian Fernyhough, Michael Finnessy, George Benjamin, Julian Anderson, Ian Pace, you know, Aaron Cassidy. There's just, it's amazing. There's such a breadth of different styles. Thomas Addis, I could go on and on. So I really think it's an incredibly impressive musical culture. And I'm very sorry that the British musical establishment is having some real problems right now, financial and structural problems, and because I think it's one of the most, if not the most robust musical scenes in Europe. I'm deeply impressed with the musical scene in Britain, and I travel to Britain as often as I can, and I always enjoy being there. And I'm hoping to go back in early September to London. Yeah, Michael Tippett, Jonathan Harvey. Yeah, those are very, of course, wonderful figures as well. I've been listening to Tippett's symphonies. I'm not convinced by them, to be perfectly honest, but I enjoy listening to them nevertheless, even when I'm not convinced. And Jonathan Harvey is, of course, a wonderful figure. Favorite modernist poets and writers? Well, oh God, there's so many. You can see them behind me. I've got 2 bookshelves of modern poetry. For the last year and a half or so, I've been reading enormous amounts of Jeremy Halvard Pren, and I set some of his poems for a new cantata that is going to be on the new album. So I was very, very intensely involved in his music, in his poetry for quite some time when I was doing that. And I still am, in fact. I'm currently reading his most recent publication at the moment. So that's the one that's on my mind a lot at the moment. Okay, everybody, I'm going to sign off now. It's been going for just about over 2 hours, and this has been an absolute pleasure. I'm so excited I got a chance to talk with all of you. We'll do this again. I'm still, you know, a bit of an amateur when it comes to live streaming. I'm sure there's ways that I could make this more interactive and improve the quality and improve the experience, and I'm going to work on that with my team. So let's do this again. Thank you all for participating. And I'm going to sign off.